Hi students, I am super excited to have an amazing professional with us today. Brian Teets of Newmont Mining is joining us to talk about fraud. He'll be joining us for a second module as well on this topic. So we are lucky to have an expert to discuss, first of all, fraud risk assessments with us. Very first, I want to kick it over to Brian to introduce himself to you, tell the students a little bit about your background and maybe one fun fact about yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Joe, and it's great to be here, and really a privilege and an honor to also participate on the advisory board for the school as well. Yeah, so my background, I am a native of Denver, Colorado. I've lived here my entire life. My entire professional career has been in Denver, which is a little bit unique. But it's been great to help me stay close to family and friends. And so I've been very fortunate to be able to have my entire career here in the Denver area. Graduated from the University of Denver back in 1990, so a long time ago. And with a degree in accounting, and really started off in public accounting, which is the direction a lot of folks in accounting take, but there are clearly other career paths as well. But started off in public accounting working for Coopers and Lybrand, so that probably gives you an indication of how old I am, because most people haven't even heard of Coopers and Lybrand these days. Now part of PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. But started my career there in the emerging markets function, working on small startup companies, and then eventually went into the larger SEC public company space. Learned a lot, was there for 5 years, and then really decided that public accounting just wasn't the long-term career fit for me. And so moved over to a company that was headquartered in Denver, First Data Corp. Again, a company that is no longer in existence, but at the time was a spinoff of American Express, large publicly traded company, who at the time that I started with them also purchased Western Union, a company that I think all of the students are probably familiar with, headquartered now in Colorado. And First Data eventually spun Western Union off in 2006 after acquiring them. But so was able to spend 12 years at First Data and Western Union. Learned a lot during that time. That was the period of time when Sarbanes-Oxley kicked off and really kind of formalized and raised the level of importance of internal controls from a financial reporting perspective, which I think the fraud risk assessment that we're talking about really ties into, but also really gave, I think, internal auditors, in addition to the work that they were already doing, a much more higher level and important role to play, helping out with SOX compliance and COSO frameworks and understanding how internal controls and risk assessments are performed. So learned a lot while I was at First Data, then left First Data in 2007 and went to work for Mark West Energy, an emerging company, about $1 billion market cap at the time. And then over the next 12 years, from 2007 to 2018, 19, grew that company, was there as that company grew from $1 billion market cap to a $15 billion market cap. So a lot of growth, but also during growth, there's a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. So spent my time there, but then with the downturn in commodity markets, Mark West sold itself to an Ohio-based company, and not wanting to leave the beautiful state of Colorado, looked for some other opportunities, and was able then to, in 2018, land at Newmont, which is the world's largest gold mining company, and headquartered in Denver. It's a 100-year-old company, and just a great company, a global company. Gives me the opportunity to work with folks internationally. And really, in all of those professional experiences, I started off at First Data in operational accounting, but just a couple of years after I started at First Data, was asked to head up the internal audit group back in 1998. So from 98 to today, I've been in internal audit. And so, there are different career paths. You can stay in internal audit for a long time, like I have, and make a career out of it. Or you can just make a stop in internal audit for a period of time, learned some of the skill sets of being objective, independent, skeptical, learned how to look across a broad range of topics, fraud risk assessments being one, and then move back into business. So from my career perspective, internal audit has really been a great career. I'll just give one little anecdote. While I was at Western Union in 2003, the company got hit with a large, and I was heading up internal audit at that time. But after the 9/11 attacks, the company got hit with a large federal fine and a consent decree in compliance, Bank Secrecy Act compliance. And so that opened up an opportunity for me to actually leave internal audit for a period of time and go into and actually lead the North America Bank Secrecy Compliance Department, using the skills and tool sets that I had developed it during my time in internal audit. But I mention this because, number one, it does open up opportunities for you because of the skill sets you learn. But during my time in compliance, I was the head of the compliance group there for a couple of years. But what I found is the day-to-day in compliance was very routine, very focused, very narrowly defined. And I found myself really missing the broader company-wide experiences that I had previously when I was the head of internal audit. And so at that time, after a couple of years in compliance, decided, I really needed to get back into internal audit so that I could have a view across the broader organization. So I just threw out that personal experience because I do think as you consider a career in internal audit, the pros and cons are you do get the opportunity to look across really every risk scenario in the company, and you're providing value to the board of directors, to the executive leadership team. The downside is that you don't really own any of those processes. So you can make recommendations, you can assess, you can evaluate, you can provide advice, but you really, at the end of the day, are handing that off to somebody else to go execute, deliver, and build. And so, like any role in any company, pros and cons. But yeah, that's been my experience in internal audit. So I'm back in internal audit now at Newmont. Loving it. We're in the middle of a large, almost $20 billion acquisition of an Australian mining company. And so, again, I think a career in internal audit opens you up to lots of interesting opportunities. One fun fact about me, I guess, is, and this is just something top of mind for me, is I've lived in Colorado all my life. Been married, just had our 32nd wedding anniversary. We have 4 kids, but now really the next phase in my life is we've got 2 grandkids on the way, one in August of this year, and then one in October of this year. So that's probably the thing I'm looking most forward to, is transitioning now from being a father to a grandfather, and really looking forward to having all the fun and none of the responsibility. So that's my fun fact. Thanks, Joe.
I love that. And so I have to ask, do you have some fun name that you are? Are you just Grandpa, or do you have some fun name that they call you?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because there's been a lot of discussion about that. It's
Yeah.
almost like when you're an expecting parent, you have to come up with a name for not only your child but your parents, right? So and that becomes critical because you're kind of saddled with that potentially for many, many years to come. So no, we haven't landed on anything yet. My wife and I are actively debating the pros and cons of many different names. But no, we haven't come up with anything yet. But yeah, it's interesting because we are actively debating that very topic as we speak.
That's so fun. And I am going to follow up with you
Yes.
in like 6 months or
Yes.
a year to find out what it is, because
Absolutely.
And what I'm hearing you saying, Brian, is that you're doing a little risk assessment here around the naming, because there are some risks in some of those names because they're going to stick with you forever.
Yes, no, you're exactly right.
I know that my mom didn't want grandma because it sounded really old. So
Yes.
That is Gigi, which is, just how they come up with these things. I don't know. But anyway,
I don't know either.
We'll get on to the topic now. We're probably boring the students, but let's talk about fraud risk assessments, because obviously you have an abundance of experience. And when I'm listening to you talk about companies like Western Union, who the fraud risk there. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
huge, right? And so, and anywhere it's huge. And
Yep.
I know at Newmont, you have your own experiences with working with different vendors and, local, different global regions. And so we'll get into that, but just talk about your overall experience with fraud risk assessments. Why are they important? Why do we need them? Just give the students some basics from your opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, fraud risk is really no different than any other risk, right? It has a consequence. And so if that consequence is above the company's risk tolerance or could in some way impact the company beyond their risk tolerance, then you have to assess the risk. So whether it's a safety risk, a financial reporting risk, fraud is no different. So the first thing to think about is, while absolutely the internal audit department is typically very involved in those types of risk assessments because of our background expertise, typically the work that we provide in doing audits and investigations. The first thing that comes to my mind is fraud is a risk with a consequence, no different than any other risk. And so what you're trying to do in this risk assessment is really understand a couple of key things. Number one, what are the drivers or the causes or the potential scenarios that allow that risk to manifest itself? So again, just like safety, you would show up at a mine site and start to look at the potential safety causes. So fall of heights, confined spaces, unintentional release of energy. You start to define those causes. And so with fraud risk, you do the same thing. And at the companies I've worked for, you always start with, how can this risk manifest itself? I think with fraud, it's the other thing that's important to start off with is what really is the risk tolerance of the company. Because that'll help you determine if you even need to do the assessment at all. So some companies like Newmont, you might say, well, what's the risk of gold price? Well, Newmont, that's definitely a risk for us. There are times in my time at Newmont where gold price has been up to $1,900 where it is today, and it's been as low as $1,300. Well, that has a significant impact and it's a risk to the company, but the company also has an extremely high risk tolerance. We're willing to accept whatever the market is going to bring in terms of gold price. So we don't hedge gold price. We accept whatever the market brings. And so there's not a lot of risk assessment done around gold price. Yes, we try to understand what it is, but we don't have controls necessarily in place to manage that risk. Where fraud risk, if you were to talk to your executive team or your board of directors, you need to understand what is their tolerance for fraud. And typically in a company, it's a pretty easy answer, right? There's really a pretty low tolerance for fraud. And so why is that important? The lower the tolerance that the company has for a risk, the more controls, the more resources, the more effort the company is going to invest to manage that risk. The higher the tolerance, the less resources, the less investment, the less time and effort will be spent. So I just throw that out that no matter what risk assessment you're doing, a great starting place is, what is the tolerance for this risk? So when you're talking about fraud, of course, it's always low because there's a huge reputational risk. There's potentially significant financial risk and consequence. And so you want to make sure, and there could even be regulatory consequences as well. If you think about financial reporting fraud, people can go to jail and there can be significant regulatory consequences. So the first thing you do is you define your risk and you start to define the causes, the scenarios that cause that risk to manifest itself. And the way we do that at Newmont is on an annual basis, we have a risk assessment that a specific fraud risk assessments that's performed every year. It's requested by the audit committee. So we're not doing it necessarily on behalf of management as much as the board specifically wants a report out on fraud risk on an annual basis. And our process is to understand what those potential fraud risk scenarios are, is we sit down with all of the key functions in the company. So in our fraud risk assessment, we have 17 different functions. So this isn't a risk that is impacted by one or two functions, accounting or payroll or HR. We look across health and safety, IT, supply chain, our sustainability group. So really all of our key functions in the company, we interview them on an annual basis, and we really define what are the fraud scenarios for every one of those functions. And in doing that, every year, the number of scenarios that we've identified remains relatively constant. So the first year you do your assessment, there's obviously a lot of initial work, but as we do these updates year over year, we're a $40 billion company, and about $11 billion in revenue. We have about 110 fraud risk scenarios in the Newmont environment. And that might seem like a lot, it might not seem like enough, but that's where we've kind of landed on. Those are the significant scenarios that we've identified. And again, they're across 17 different functions. So once you've done that step and you have a good, clear understanding, and again, not just internal audit doing this in a vacuum. I think sometimes internal audit can be tempted to try to do some of this work on their own, just using their own expertise and understanding of the business. But it's really critical to get your business partners and stakeholders involved. So, once we've identified those scenarios, we've defined them. So now we know what the potential causes of the fraud risk in the company are. The next step that we do is we map all of those scenarios to defined and formally documented and formally assessed controls in the environment. So we don't just say, okay, well, we have fictitious payroll. We may have a ghost employee somewhere in the business, and so somebody is getting a paycheck for a non-existent employee. That could be a fraud risk scheme in the payroll space. We don't just say, well, payroll has some procedures in place to monitor new employee additions to the system. We actually make sure that whatever control we're linking to that assessment is a formally defined control that is performed, and not only is performed, but is assessed. In other words, there is a review or validation process by either management or internal audit that control is actually working. So, and then we do that for every single scenario. So as we've gone through our process, every fraud risk has one or more controls linked to it. And then you step back once you've said, okay, here's my scenarios, fictitious employees. Here are my controls, whether it's one control or 5 controls. Are those controls designed sufficiently, and do they have enough precision to identify really the level of risk we want to manage fraud to? So we sit down with management, we work through that. And what we find is that, we're probably now 10 years into our fraud risk assessment process. Those controls and scenarios don't change significantly year over year, but we do find that like when COVID hit and there's other significant influences to the company, maybe a large acquisition or maybe a divestiture of some kind or significant layoffs, we do find that the scenarios can change a little bit or that the controls need to change. And so that's really what the audit committee is looking for, is that as you've performed your assessment, you've defined your risk, you've defined your scenarios, you've defined your controls, and then finally, you make sure that those controls are actually operating effectively, and that there is timely monitoring over those controls. Then what we do is we put together a report that kind of outlines all of those controls and all of those scenarios, and we report on that to the audit committee. The one thing that I would say is changing in our report out, historically, we would just say, okay, audit committee, there are no known gaps in the control environment, and there are no significant deficiencies in the operating effectiveness of those controls. So you kind of do a design assessment of your controls and an operating effectiveness assessment. And really that was where we kind of would report out, and the audit committee would then, take comfort in the fact that there were no significant gaps or deficiencies in the controls. The thing that Newmont is undertaking right now that's new and different as we move forward is we're introducing a new concept And we're calling it kind of risk management capability. And so in addition to reporting out, as we have historically, on scenarios and controls and any open deficiencies, we're also reporting out on each of those 17 functions, what we call a risk management capability. So we have a series of criteria that we've put together that says, these are the things that this function head should be doing to effectively manage risk over fraud or other things in their environment. And they end up with a maturity score from 1 being immature to 5 being extremely mature. So a typical 5-scale maturity model. And each of those 17 functions then get reported out on. Not only do they have gaps or in design or effectiveness, but also what's their risk management capability, to give the audit committee and the ELT a level of comfort that the functions that are managing fraud risk have the right level of resources. They understand the risk tolerance. They have good monitoring in place, the 3 lines of defense. All of those things are considered, and then we give a score. So where the audit committee in the future is going to be looking to, I think, is probably less on, is there a specific gap or a specific deficiency, but probably also really interested in, for the functions that are managing this risk, what's their level of risk management capability? Are they mature? Do they have the right people, the right resources, the right culture? Or are there gaps there as well? So just something that at Newmont we're starting to report out on as well. And again, we're in the early stages, but that's a new area that I'd recommend students really think about, is not just the defined controls and risks, but also what is the risk management capability of the company you're working for in a broader context. So at a high level, that's our process. It goes into a formal report. We do that once a year, and we're getting ready to kick that off again for 2023.
I love how much you tied this individual risk assessment, being fraud risk assessment, to the greater organization. And the students have already talked about enterprise risk management. Yep. We had Sean Tebben talk to us about that in another video, but this is a subset of that, right? And yes, it is, as you said, a really important one, because the tolerance for fraud is so low. I just have one other kind of quick question, and we'll wrap this one up. You mentioned, payroll schemes, ghost employees. When I'm thinking about other type of fraud risks, I think of things like even just stealing, theft of cash, right? We know one of the things we want to do is to get cash out of and live checks out of organizations. So we hope that the risk of misappropriation of cash or any assets, is low. So we're watching that. Billing schemes, vendors. I know for you, maybe vendors are huge for a company like Newmont. What other fraud risks? I know you said you had 110 scenarios. Can you just throw out for the students so they can get to just thinking about the different businesses and different risks?
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. Again, like I said, we have a number of 110 fraud risk scenarios. And so what I was just going to do here is pull up really quickly. I think I've got it here.
I kind of put you on the spot there. I know you even mentioned some other ones, like financial statement manipulation. Obviously, in the accounting department is a huge risk. Yeah. I think sometimes for students to think about conflicts of interest or theft of IP, intellectual property, that confidential information. That's why you come up with so many, and whether they thought 110 was a lot or too little, I think it depends on what you think of as a fraud risk, because that can be, pretty broad.
Yeah. Well, and, again, when you think about, so I was just going to just mention here quickly the different functions that we've identified. So, some of those, of course, are accounting and financial reporting, human resources. You just mentioned information technology. We even have legal as one of the functions, because legal is making sure that, our contracts are valid and that we're following contracts, we're following regulations in the company. And you can have a fraud risk of underreporting on a regulatory basis that could cause the company reputational damage. Companies have gotten in trouble for that in the past. Our operations team and our projects team, there are lots of potential fraud risks, especially in our major projects when it comes to spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on projects. Are you actually getting what you're paying for? You can have a project that comes in right on budget and right on time, but you may not have what you actually was in the original scope. When I was working for an oil and gas company I mentioned earlier, we had a situation where we had management that was building compressor stations, which help move gas down the pipeline. But they would spend the money on the project and indicate that they were on time and on budget, but then internal audit, we would go out and do some assessments, and we found that they would cut costs, like there wouldn't be fencing put around the compressor station, or the compressor station was supposed to have a building over the compressor station to minimize noise and weather damage to the compressor station, other things like that, that the project came in on budget, but it didn't have all of the components that were originally in scope for that project, right? So that's an element of fraud as well. Management was saying, yeah, we completed the project, but really they hadn't completed the project. And so, so that's an example. In our reserves and resource reporting, we have to make sure that if we tell the world that we've got, 100 million ounces in the ground, that there are controls in place that we really do have 100 million ounces in the ground, because that's where people invest. And then supply chain, I said sustainability and external reporting. That's becoming an even bigger issue as people think about ESG and environmental sustainability. Newmont has an annual sustainability report that we put out every year. It has hundreds of pages of information in it, and there is fraud risk that we're saying things about our water treatment, about our community investment, that's not true. And so there's a fraud risk there. So, and then tax and treasury. So those are the types of functions. And when you go talk to those functions, you really start to think about, and you really have to think about human intent, right? It's because all fraud gets back to there's some opportunity there, and there's some need or personal benefit that somebody's going to get out of the situation, right? You find a lot of times that fraud risk emerges because of bonus calculation. So Newmont, we have a short-term bonus. It's an annual bonus. Every year we get paid a bonus, and it's based on certain metrics. An internal audit every year performs an audit over that bonus program to make sure that those metrics were really met. And so that's another potential for fraud. So what I would say is, as creative as human beings can become, is how many fraud scenarios you're going to have to think about. And the other thing is, as soon as you create a control that's effective, humans will figure out a way to get around that control. So you have to, that's why we do this on an annual basis, is you have to be vigilant. You can't feel like you're ever done, because as long as human beings are a part of the process, fraud risk will always be a risk for the company.
Yeah, I like, as you're talking, I'm hearing the fraud triangle in my head.
Yep.
When are humans going to rationalize something? Yep. Where is the opportunity? Where are the incentives, the pressure, the motivation? You're right. All of those factors you have to relook at every year. So. Yep. Well, thank you, Brian. We're going to cut this video because, I love the example you gave, and we get to invite Brian back for another module to talk about fraud investigations. So maybe those are out of an audit that we do, or maybe we get a tip. So we're going to hear about maybe some other examples that he's had in his career. So thank you, Brian, and we'll see you in the next module.
All right. Thanks, Jill.